Today I'm going to be refuting against Rebecca Rodriguez on the topic of death penalty. And so the death penalty is a cruel and inhumane punishment for any reason and anyone. Taking a life from someone else puts you in a position in which makes you just as bad as a criminal who committed a capital crime. In today's society, many people would approve of the death penalty for many different reasons to benefit themselves or others. Even though many will agree that the death penalty benefits society, it actually has greater disadvantages to society than benefits. So first, the advocate claims that resources such as tax money will have more utility when used for reform as opposed to sustaining lifelong criminals. But in fact, the death penalty actually costs more than sentencing criminals life in prison, because there are many processes to go to in order to finalize the death of the individual. It would be inhumane to accuse one of capital crime and sentence them to death without proper evidence and reasonable accusations. According to the death penalty focus, the death penalty is much more expensive than life without parole, because the Constitution requires a long and complex judicial process for capital cases. This process is needed in order to ensure that the innocent men and women are not executed for crimes they did not commit. Huffington Post reported that more than 4% of inmates sentenced to death in the United States are probably innocent. This is practically murder for false accusations of individuals who are actually innocent. Unfortunately, it will take a miracle to be able to resurrect the victim, in which is very likely for that to happen. An article written by the ACLU in 2008 called "The Hidden Death Tax" claims that death row will cost California $4 billion more than instead of being sentenced to die in prison due to disease, injury, or old age. Many activities happen in prison and often can be potentially fatal. And the second point that advocate claims is that inmates willing and able to reform are provided with fewer programs due to excessive amount of funding used on insubordinate criminals. But the thing is that there's always programs available, and programs are widely available to inmates as an alternative to the death penalty. Many of the individuals out there are willing to help rehabilitate inmates for the better. It gives criminals a second chance to improve themselves and potentially restore the damages they have done, and possibly even more. On NBC News, a program which helps prisoners rehabilitate through training dogs gives you a purpose. It's a program that was started by a nun. An inmate named Jerry McMullen, convicted of murder, has improved his behavior through his program by training these dogs to become service dogs, which helps others medically and physically based on the condition of what the individual has. And third, the claim the advocate stated was the death penalty ensures that unreformed murderers will never be integrated into society, which is no guarantee, because anywhere and everywhere you go, there's always going to be a good and bad to everything. In this case, there's always going to be someone who's going to have the intention to murder. So the death penalty is a cruel and inhumane for punishment. Though one may take life away from another, it does not make morals any better by eventually retaliating and sentencing the criminal to death. Revenge and pride are two traits that negatively impact the people to act in an uncivilized manner. And it is also hypocritical to believe that murder is wrong and results in sentencing criminals to death penalty after they have committed a capital crime. And lastly, what I would like to also incorporate is like racial disparities contribute to death penalty as well. The ethnicities of criminals can significantly contribute whether they will put to death or not. Unfortunately, we live in a society where racism is always a problem. The statistics provided by NAACP states how that the race of death row inmates are 41% black, 11% Hispanic, 44% white, and 3% other. This shows how the leading ethnicities executed are blacks and whites by a significant amount. And all in all, the death penalty should not be considered for a punishment. It causes additional money spent on death, revokes the opportunity for criminals to have a second chance, and hypocrisy of murdering individuals. The ideal solutions to punishments are rehabilitation programs, imprisonments for a second chance. It's always better to be the better person, and it's always good to be the change you want to see in the world.
All right, well, you start off with a value set of claims that you're applying to the issue of fact, and I think that that's a little bit problematic because addressing an issue of fact with secondary claims of value changes the nature of the argument, and that's not really what we're looking for on this particular situation. The argument that I think does apply here is that there are disadvantages that outweigh whatever benefits there would be to having more frequent executions, and I think that that is something, as long as you can quantify it, will respond to the advocate's factual issues, not to the value issues. I don't remember if the advocate presented value issues, by the way, as well, so there may be a reason that your value issues pop up, but they weren't being directly applied to a value claim that you identified in the advocate's position. On the disadvantages, the first one is the cost issue, and I think you do a pretty good job explaining what the cost is when it comes to the appellate process. The notion that 4% of the population is likely to be innocent, I think that's an interesting statistic. You need to kind of explain a little bit more what the ramification of that is and talk about what the consequence to society is should that occur. And I think that in a sense of creating some way that we could balance against whatever alleged benefits there are, that would count. And it's not even a value claim because you're talking about people being executed who are in fact innocent. That's a claim of fact. The hidden cost, the $4 billion from the ACLU, there's not really much explanation of over what time period we're talking about and how that's perceived. If that's an annual cost, that makes it pretty substantial. If it's over a period of time, it may not be all that important. On your second point, you assert that there is in fact these kinds of programs that are available. The advocate's position seems to be that there's going to be a shortage of money for these kinds of programs, and we're spending all the money on maintaining or housing criminals that aren't going to benefit from these programs and denying the benefits to criminals who might receive some benefit from that. And the example of the dog training thing, I think, is a good point. But I think the advocate would probably agree with you on these points. We ought to have these kinds of programs for people, but we can't afford them because we're spending all this money taking care of people that should be executed. Instead, we're keeping them for years and years and years, and that soaks up all the cash. So I think that argument doesn't really get you very far unless you can show, for instance, that these programs exist regardless of how much we spend on the execution of prisoners or housing them. The third point basically comes back to, you assert that it's not going to make any difference. She asserts that it's going to make a difference. I don't remember what the advocate's evidence on this point was, but yours was definitely not substantial here. You get to a side issue that talks about racial discrimination in the process. I don't know how we measure that and how we weigh it in this context. It's a point that's definitely valid if we're making a policy comparison, but on the issue of fact that the advocate's presenting, I'm not sure that it's particularly relevant. There's a lot of reading going on in the presentation, and I think you need to speak to us a little bit more. All right, thank you. Becca, you're going to be next.